We're gonna go into training for strength endurance and what you can do to improve your own strength endurance. And we're gonna start right now. Before we get into the meat and potatoes and how you can actually train for strength endurance, we have to go into what the heck is strength endurance. So we're doing a prolonged activity that requires a large amount of muscular tension, okay? But we wanna see a minimal decrease in efficiency for that muscular tension. So the efficiency has to maintain at a high rate. And good examples for means of strength endurance would be, let's say specifically for a rower or a boxer or a swimmer. Okay, so think about a swimmer, they're swimming a 400-yard or 400-meter butterfly. After that first lap, second lap, now they're getting into the third and fourth lap. Now we're gonna have to start to really focus on that strength endurance. If you have a fighter, someone who's fighting in the UFC or in MMA, by the end of that first round, they're already tapping into their training that's going to increase their strength endurance. And if we think about even a wrestler, okay, so if we're talking about the international style, we're wrestling freestyle, we're gonna have that first period where they're gonna start to tap into strength endurance, and then most of that second period is gonna be really hammering the attributes that that athlete has trained around strength endurance. And a lot of this goes back to how does your body handle CO2? How does your body handle lactic acid? How does your body handle it globally? And then how does your body handle it locally in specific muscular groups? And then even thinking about CrossFitters, strongmen, all of these types of athletes need some sense of strength endurance, and even weightlifters, shot putters, typically athletes that are gonna be power-based sports, they need a little bit of strength endurance to a point within their own personal training, within their own training sessions. Okay, because they might have a training session that lasts, over an hour and a half to 2 hours. So there's a bunch of different factors that go into strength endurance, but it's key to understand the main focus here is that if we have muscular tension in a movement, again, think about wrestlers, they're in a collar tie, they're always, grappling. They need to have a minimal decrease in the muscular efficiency and the muscular coordination throughout that prolonged activity. Okay, so now we're specifically gonna go into some more of the theory behind it. And then after we cover the theory on how we can analyze strength endurance, then we're gonna go deeper into the actual examples and actual situations that you can utilize inside your own training. So we've gotta understand right away, fast twitch muscle fibers. Fast twitch muscle fibers is gonna be most related to maximal power output. And then if we have, let's say, slower twitch muscle fibers. So slower twitch muscle fibers are going to be more related to longer endurance. If we're going for a mile run, that's going to be much more slower twitch. Okay, so going back to that fast twitch, we can think about executing a vertical jump. Now, and then finally, if we go into understanding, there might be some instances where we have to have fast twitch muscle fibers and we have to have slow twitch muscle fibers working together. So that might be a sport like wrestling where you actually have to have a large amount of power output, but we also have to have a large amount of aerobic capacity. Same thing with a sport like CrossFit. Okay, and now if we go into, in 1990, Bruner and Tabachnik came up with and started to understand and recognize that there's really this hybrid style of muscle fiber. That was essentially like the first time in science where we're like, there actually might be another fiber here that's a little bit of a combination between a fast twitch and a slower twitch fiber. And that's typically where we're gonna wanna work most of our efforts if we're in a sport that requires a large amount of strength endurance. Remember, rowing, boxing, fighting, swimming, and then CrossFit, strongman, even all this stuff. Now we have to have really, really potent fast twitch muscle fibers, but we also have to find the easiest means and the easiest ways to train those aerobic, slower twitch muscle fibers. And then that's gonna take us into that next step before we get into that direct application is I like to look at it from a large magnitude, and that might be from an actual global perspective and a little bit more time involved, and then from that smaller magnitude. So that might be actually digging down into a localized specific area. Okay, so the first thing that we've got to do is that large magnitude. This could be an example in training where we actually would use on the minute cleans. And this is something that we do with our football players. Okay, so football does need to have strength endurance. Football players, before we're going into the season, we might do 15 to 16 sets of singles or even doubles sometimes at a certain percentage with 45 to 60 seconds rest. Okay, so what this mimics, it mimics what you're gonna be doing on the field. It's a shorter rest period and it's happening cyclically, okay, over and over and over again. So you might have to do a power clean or a two box clean, anything like that. And then we can get into another aspect if we have this large magnitude. Okay, so going back to the on the minutes, that might be a 15 to 16 minute round, right? And then we can get into actual sport play. So using swimmers, using wrestlers as an example, is if you develop the motor and you identify as a strength coach that this individual has great aerobic capacity, but they can really increase their dynamic power output. Well, we need to train that dynamic power output while also recognizing and understanding that they still have to maintain that aerobic capacity that they already have. That's an example with Nick Wazowski, our two-time world bronze medalist. He has phenomenal aerobic capacity, but one of those things is he's got to get stronger. He has to get a little bit more explosive. He's got to hold positions a little bit better. When we first started working together, now, 4 or 5 years later, he's great in all areas. That comes back to actually training sport play. So if we're in the weight room, we're trying to focus on that dynamic capacity or the aerobic capacity, and we're building that up in the weight room. But then there's also that specific transfer from just getting minutes on the mat, or if you're a swimmer, getting more meters in, getting more volume in the pool. If you're a distance runner, getting more volume in out, running 100 miles a week. That's what these top-notch guys are doing. And so that goes back to that sport play. And other examples of means to increase that large magnitude. And so this might be an interval-based training on an assault bike, on a rower, but you're doing something cyclical over and over again. Then we're going to get into jumps or throws over a longer period of time. So some people will shy away from this because they don't want it to diminish power output potentially. But if you train athletes properly with jumps, with throws, you can actually increase their strength endurance, but you have to actually focus and really understand how to do that properly because it can get very challenging. And then finally, just doing specific rounds of something. Again, this is similar to that sport play, but let's use the example of a wrestler or of an MMA fighter, is that we might go 30 seconds of an all-out scramble for wrestling, or we might go 30 seconds or even 10 seconds of an all-out push on an assault bike, and then back off into that rest period. So you're using that rounds theory. Okay, so then the next two things that we need to do is we need to understand there is a point where we have to do technical work under fatigue, because if we're training strength endurance, we want it to transfer really well to whatever that technical sport is that we're doing. So there's points where in the weight room, you want to get somebody into a high level of fatigue and then do a little bit of technical work in the weight room. That's okay. But now we can get into that small magnitude, okay? So this would be localized to specific muscle groups, okay? So most of the time, if we're talking about strength endurance specifically, it's typically going to be your quads, your calves, your biceps, your triceps, your deltoids, your lats, a lot of your shoulders. So if you talk to a wrestler, you talk to, even a swimmer, when they get out of the pool and you see how they're feeling, they're going to be gassed and their arms are just going to be completely dead. Their lats are going to be smoked, okay? So now if we have a specific wrestler or a fighter or a swimmer or a rower, we can start to localize and say, all right, this rower, their lower back has tremendous strength endurance, but their lats and deltoids are pathetic. So now we can see that from a localized perspective and then train that locally through specific means of strength endurance. And that's where we can get into isolating those specific muscles, using drop sets, using contrast methods. And then ultimately, one of the best ways, and this is what we're going to get into in the applied section here, is one of the best ways of training both dynamically from a large magnitude and from a small magnitude is incorporating isometric actions, okay? So if we have isometric actions where we have to hold positions against an immovable object, or even just holding a position like a split lunge over a long period of time, that can help us increase our overall strength endurance, and it's not gonna totally beat us up. It's gonna be mentally challenging, and it's gonna be physically challenging, but it's a unique way to train strength endurance and have it really transfer well over to your specific sports. And so now we're gonna get into exact examples and tools that we use to increase strength endurance for various athletes. Before we learn a little more about strength endurance, let's talk about whey protein and its impact on strength endurance. One of the biggest struggles that strength endurance athletes have is trying to keep their protein intake high enough so that they don't lose a ton of muscle mass. And that's why we're working with Earth-Fed Muscle. You can pick up multi-balls. It's one of the best tasting chocolate malt proteins. They've got a whole bunch of different flavors that you can use as a strength endurance athlete to help increase your endurance and maintain that lean muscle mass. Pick up that whey protein product today at earthfedmuscle.com. Now let's get back to building that strength endurance. Okay, so as I mentioned before, one of my favorite methods to increase that large magnitude and to have a great carryover to specific sport play is going to be on the minute drills. And this could be power snatch, a power clean, any snatch or clean variation. Even, I would even argue a trap bar jump or a trap bar deadlift or a back squat or a front squat. And you might do, 10 doubles with 45 seconds rest. So you want to go at like 65 to 70% of your best power clean, of your best clean, and do a single or a double over 10 to 15 minutes, okay? Every single 45 seconds, you hit that rep. Okay, so that's a way that you can drastically increase your overall strength endurance and power endurance. And that's one of the big factors here is that we have to, and this is where a lot of strength coaches will say, well, you don't want to focus on doing an extremely explosive movement with minimal rest periods because it could, in theory, have a negative impact on your power output. But if your sport is long duration periods of contact and muscular tension, you have to learn, if you're in a 20-minute scrap in wrestling or a 20-minute period of fighting, or you're a CrossFitter and you have a session that might be an hour long, you have to have high power endurance, okay? And that's where this strength endurance stuff does come into play. So another method that we can use similar to the on the minute would be a rest pause method. And this could be a method that you're using to increase your overall power output and your overall maximal strength. And then later on, you might use that rest pause locally with some bicep work. But I would even recommend here, let's say you do a back squat. You do a back squat for 4, you rest 30 seconds. You do another back squat for 4, you rest 30 seconds. You do another back squat for 4. And this might be at 80 to 85% of your max. Basically, you go until you feel like total death. And this is going to help increase your strength, but it's also going to help drastically improve your strength endurance and your mental acuity because it is extremely challenging. Now, mechanical drop sets. This is a really, really good way to train both the large magnitude and the small magnitude. A mechanical drop set example would be that we want to do some type of big movement first. So let's say a back squat or a front squat, right? And then that next movement that we want to do after that back squat might be a goblet squat, so it's a little bit easier. And then that final movement might be more isolation focused. So then it's going to be, back squat, goblet squat into even, and this would be unique where you might get into sled work, pulling a sled backwards and you're just basically isolating your quads, doing a leg extension if you have issues with quad fatigue late in a period or whatever sport that you're doing. Maybe you go back squat to stimulate your quads, and you go, a Spanish squat, so it's a goblet squat with a band around your knees, and then you go into a large amount of leg extensions where you can go 25 to 30 reps. So the mechanical aspect, it gets easier each exercise. This could be similar to pre-fatigue or post-fatigue even, but mechanical drop sets can be used to really train globally. And then if you have that specific area, let's say a good example would be your lats. Okay, so now we go a rope climb. So it's a very challenging coordinative movement. So you're doing a rope climb, okay? And then the next exercise that you're gonna do is going to be, a weighted reclining row or a neutral grip pull-up. That might be that second mechanical point after the rope climb. The rope climb is very challenging, and then a simple pull-up here, and you might do 5 to 7 reps. And then you have to go do a sled pull with a rope, where that's easy from a coordination point, but it's challenging because it might take you 30 to 50 seconds to get that done. And it's really gonna focus on your lats, your biceps, and your grip. So that's a way to use that mechanical drop set if you're a swimmer, if you're, if you are a rower, even if you are a wrestler. And now power work with intervals. This is another really good example. So this could be a little bit more of an undulation in an entire session, but now we spend, let's say, the first 35 minutes of a training session where we are just focusing directly on max power output and then maximal strength. And so this is what I stole directly from Phil DARU, one of the best strength coaches in the entire world, who trains some of the best MMA fighters in the world. Okay, and so what we did is he put me through an entire workout where we really focused on maximal strength and maximal power output. And then we sort of took a 5 to 10 minute break just to try and regroup. And then we hit that interval based training. So you can get on the assault bike, you can go, 10 to 15 seconds at max wattage, and then back off for 45 to 50 seconds, and then do that 5, 6, 7 times. And that's gonna really train your power output, and it's gonna train your overall strength endurance. And you're gonna get stronger and increase your strength endurance. So you're gonna have better efficiency later on in a fight or later on in a match. Now, long duration steady state. I think this is one of the easiest ways to increase your gas tank. Okay, so if we're thinking about strength endurance, I think it is extremely easy to focus on specifics on the minutes, to focus on mechanical drop sets. Those are easy things to train, but the best means that I've found is training long duration steady state. Okay, so that might mean you get on the assault bike and you hold a specific RPMs. Let's say you hold 60 RPMs for 35 to 40 minutes. Okay, so it's like one of those areas where it's hard, but it's not gonna ruin your training, okay? It's just, you've just gotta be into it a little bit. It's not overly challenging. You can still have conversations while you're training. You can actually still, listen to an audiobook or whatever you want, but it will challenge you enough to get your wind going so that you have to process CO2 a little bit more effectively. And that's the whole goal here. So long duration steady state, and I like to do this on a rower, a ski erg, on an assault bike, because it's not going to beat you up. It's going to be cyclical based, and it can really help you focus on your quads or on your lats, because that's where you're going to feel it later on. And then finally, when we get into it, there's a lot of science, the efficacy of stimulating heat shock proteins. Okay, so if you get in the sauna 4 to 5 days a week for 30 minutes at a time, 20 to 30 minutes at a time at 170 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to help your strength endurance. Now, you still have to train, you still have to do all this other stuff. It's not the magic bullet, but it will help with recovery and it will help with strength endurance. And then finally, the absolute best means here would be, let's take an isometric example, okay? So let's say you have a wrestler who struggles with strength endurance in their bicep or in their grip. You can do specifically focused work where you do a sled pull, or you do a rope climb, and in the period in between where you're resting, you could hold isometrically a barbell at 90 degrees, okay? And you could do something similar to that where, let's say you do a sled pull forward, a sled push back to the other side of the gym, and then a sled pull backwards, okay? So you're doing 3 types of movements on a sled. And then you isometrically hold a split squat or a lunge for 90 seconds on each side, okay? At 90 degrees. So that's a way to drastically increase your strength endurance, because you're going to be able to put out a large amount of power and a large amount of strength into the sled, and then you're using that recovery time with that isometric action. And so the main goal here then is that you have to have some ability after you would execute this, and maybe this would be done, you have an on the minute or a rest pause setup, and at the end of the training session, you do 20 minutes of steady state cardio. After that, I always recommend doing some type of technical work while you're fatigued. That might mean visualization. That might mean sort of like shadow boxing if you're a fighter or you're a wrestler, shadow drilling. If you're a thrower, doing some type of mimicking something with a band. Anything that has a lower level of intensity, but you're still stimulating your mind to execute technically while you're under fatigue, because that's the main goal. If we're going to increase our strength endurance, we need it to transfer over to our specific sport. So you can use all of these different concepts directly in your training, but you have to break down, where are you struggling the most? Are you struggling from that large global magnitude, or are you struggling in a localized specific muscle? And if you are, you can use isolation movements. You could even do something as simple as a pull-up with a 50 straight curls because your biceps just die when you're wrestling. Well, that's a drop set using contrast training, using isolation methods to increase the strength endurance in a localized specific muscle group. So don't shy away from bodybuilding movements. Don't shy away from using all of these different examples to improve your overall strength endurance. So this concept is extremely challenging. It's difficult to understand, but there's a lot of different moving pieces at play. And we use information like this inside of our Sports Performance Bible to help you guys understand these concepts and apply it directly into your training, you can click on the link down below, head over to garagestrength.com, and you can pick up our Sports Performance Bible book and video course to help you understand sports performance training. Remember, cultivate your power. Peace.